Hello, kindred spirits. This is Amy, and this is the Talkin' Appalachian podcast. So, Crystal Wilkinson contributed to part two of Talking Appalachian. She contributed a short story called Holler, and I got to know her through that process of editing and putting the book together. And I interviewed her right before her book Perfect Black was set to come out. So, in this interview, we're talking about dialect and we're talking about writing and the craft of writing and what it means to be Appalachian and what it means for her to be Appalachian. But I just wanted to share, just sort of update you on some things that she's got going on right now. So she's a recent fellowship recipient of the Academy of American Poets. And she has a new book coming out that you can pre-order from Penguin Random House called Praisesong for the Kitchen Ghosts, which is a culinary memoir, and I love that title. Perfect Black, a collection of poems and three works of fiction. The Birds of Opulence, which she talks about quite a bit in this interview. Water Street and Blackberries. She's the recipient of an NAACP Image Award for Outstanding Poetry. She's won an O. Henry Prize, a USA Artist Fellowship, Ernest J. Gaines Prize for Literary Excellence. I mean, she has just won so many awards and accolades, and they're all so well deserved. She teaches creative writing at the University of Kentucky, where she is a Bush Holbrook Endowed Professor. Here's Crystal Wilkinson.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me, Amy.
So let's talk about voice. And I know that voice is important in your work, and I have used some of your essays on voice, and I know that so many of us can connect in the fact that we grew up with a vernacular dialect. We grew up with a home voice that we maybe became ashamed of because of mainstream America's perception of it, and had that struggle with, do I keep it? Do I lose it? And then we came back to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So can you talk about the importance of voice for you and the importance of voice in your work?
Yeah, I think voice is heritage, right? It's part of heritage. And I am one of those people that spent a good deal of time. I graduated from high school when I was 16. So I remember trying to prepare for this, like it was a big deal in my family. And so I was preparing for it by, instead of studying, I was sort of studying in the mirror and trying to get rid of my accent. I spent a good deal of time trying to do that. And even all through undergrad, I spent a good deal of time trying to rid myself of my accent. And then something happened, a shift occurred. And I think part of what was happening with that shift is that I was writing more. I was a journalism major, but on the side, I was writing poems and stories. My grandparents were also getting older, and I just felt this urgent need to know everything about them and to know everything about my ancestors and where I was from. And so when I would go home from college, I would take this is going to age me, a camcorder, and I would take my pens and my notebook, and I would try to write down everything they said. And so suddenly it dawned on me that if I turn my back on my mother tongue, then I'm turning my back on my ancestors. And I reached a point where I stopped doing that. And I also sort of simultaneously reached a point where I stopped trying to write about New York or Chicago, places that I hadn't even been. But I also dropped this farce of trying to speak that way and begin to embrace what I call my mother tongue, and allow, I think in that essay, the essay that you're talking about on being country, I say something like, I allowed my tongue to rest in its normal state. Yeah. And I think that's where I am now with it. This idea of one voice, so to speak, is ridiculous. There's not a one voice in America, and that sort of Midwestern sound that we hear on the news is not all of our voices. That sort of homogenized voice. It just took me a long time to come back around to that and embrace it. in both the written word and in the spoken word. And we have been made to feel shame for the way that we sound. And I think what I try to do as an academic, as a professor, is to not code switch out of my voice, especially in the most professional circles, is when I try to make sure there's a tendency, because it's still in me, to feel shame because we've been made to feel ashamed for so long. But I try really hard not to code switch, even though after years of doing that, I can certainly put it on. Sometimes I just want to put on a new voice so I don't have to talk about my accent. Like I do that with bill collectors and with with bills. You know, you want to get it done, so you don't want to have to explain where you're from and go through all of that. So sometimes I just code switch out, get the business taken care of, and then allow my tongue to rest in its normal state. But it's certainly freeing. I think that I'm respecting the legacy of my ancestry by speaking that way. And it's certainly, so we should stop even saying that we have an accent, because it's everybody else that has the accent, right?
I have a t-shirt that says that. Yeah, Silas and I talked about this when he was on. I've talked with all the authors about this. Jane and I talked about this too. And he mentioned, you know, that he's careful to keep his, because it's complicated as an academic, right? He's careful to keep his grammar consistent, standard English, but he has not compromised the phonetic part. You know, he still turns on the lights and things like that.
Yeah.
So is that a struggle for you, or do you just, is it more about the sound than it is about the grammar patterns?
If it's not on the page, and sometimes even on the page, I'm a horrible grammarist. So sometimes I make an effort to speak correct grammar, but I also don't believe that intelligence is ensconced. I believe in dialect or in code switching out. I was at a meeting the other day, and it was an Appalachian Studies meeting, and there were a lot of people from various universities in there. Of course, the wisest woman in that room was a mountain woman, and I could see, even though it wasn't really for Appalachian Studies, but you could see, of course, this was in Zoom, but you could see the reaction, and suddenly there was a reverence for her because she was the most intelligent. She was one of the elders in the room, but she was the most intelligent person in that room and could go toe to toe with anybody else. But she sounded like us.
Mm-hmm.
So people were like, their mouths were dropping because she was doing it. You know, she was dropping the knowledge, but my back got straighter. I was like, go.
It does make a difference. It does validate you. And I still struggle with that, what you were describing with the shame or the understanding that there are people who will never accept it. You know, no matter what we do or what we say, there are people that will never accept it. The online journal Still, STILL, published, I believe it was a presentation you gave at Berea about a dialect, and you said Black Appalachian vernacular at the core of a writer's work can be a revolutionary act, which is a really powerful statement.
Yeah.
Dialect is a revolutionary act.
Yeah, I see it as a revolutionary act. I see it as a political act to be myself and to encourage other writers in my field to be themselves on the page. So I began this sort of radical, if you will, thing with my writing, to where even when I'm writing third person, I don't feel an obligation to some sort of neutralize third person. And in that same talk, in that same article, I said, why can't, if I'm writing an omniscient narrator, you know, why can't it be an elder Black mountain woman like my grandmother? Somewhere in there, I say that. And I've sort of embraced that, because if I know, and I'm not talking about religion, but my omniscient voice when I'm writing is not Walter Cronkite. Like, it's not that sort of Midwestern homogenized voice. My omniscient voice speaks like my people. And that's a hierarchical position when you're writing omniscience. And this is the all-knowing narrator. So of course it's a political act. It's revolutionary to make her a woman, to think of, if you think of omniscience as God, to make God a woman and to have her have a twang and for her to be Black. It's all revolutionary.
And I'm so glad when you said that you're going to be working with kids on this, because that's going to change their lives, because we are institutionalized from the very earliest point of school. It's going to, teachers are going to grapple with it. But, it's because when I do workshops and we talk about code switching and things like that, it's a paradigm shift for a lot of people, because it's an institutionalized belief that there's a good English and there's a bad English, and there's no in between.
The systemic issues with it are ingrained. I can remember summers that I would teach for our governor's school for the arts, and the students would come in and I'd be so happy because I knew what counties they were from. But then I would have these students that wouldn't say much. These were artsy kids. They were kids who wanted to be writers, and they had, outscored everyone else and had come. But finally, as you get through that it was a 3-week program. And finally, as you got through that first week and you got to know them and you gave them the freedom to write and to talk, they had been told, don't you go up there and make us look bad. Work on how you speak. Like, make sure you don't go up there and make us look bad. Because by up there, it was in Louisville at one point, and then it was in Lexington at another point. And so they came in proud, but also feeling some kind of shame about speaking, and thought they were going to be made fun of.
Hello, kindred spirits. If you like the content I'm putting into the world about the culture of Appalachia, and you just want to support the podcast, there are links in my show notes where you can do just that. Whether your support buys me a cup of coffee during these long hours of editing, I do it all myself, or if you want to offer a monthly contribution, for which I'm happy to include your name or organization or your book as a supporter on our show notes and give you early access to episodes and other perks. Maybe you can just share the episodes you love the most and spread the word about us, which is totally free. I appreciate you and any support you have to spare. Find me on patreon.com/Talking Appalachian Podcast or at Talking Appalachian on Facebook and Instagram. And don't forget to keep talking Appalachian.
So you have some work to read for us?
I do. Since we're talking about dialect, I thought I would read a couple of poems that are in the voices of my people. And this first one also confronts another issue, which is mental illness. My mother suffered from schizophrenia. And so this is about her. And then in the middle of it is a little story that she told me that's in her voice. It's called Black Rapunzel. My mother's girlhood drifts beneath the bloody wound of shock treatments. Her memory, a dull knife in some country woman's kitchen. One time when I was real little, all women from down home begin their stories this way. Daddy had this old horse out in the barn, and he told us not to ride it while him and Mama were at the store. They rode that horse all day, and then when it was my turn, that horse fell over dead. They all blamed me, and I was the one who got the beating. My grandfather told me once that Mama was the prettiest one on the place, said she had great long hair, as if schizophrenia had erased her beauty. I was 7, a daughter already plagued by the shame of her mother's sickness. In the calyx of my imagination, Mama became our Black Rapunzel, letting down her hair, some black and shiny miracle sent to save us all. I'll read three other poems. These are all from my grandfather's voice. And my grandfather was, he was a deacon in the church. He was a tobacco farmer. He made molasses. He had a few head of dairy cattle. He picked blackberries, and he was a water witch. So in case you don't know what a water witch is, it's a dowser. And if you don't know what a dowser is, it was someone who was given the gift, and they would pick a certain branch off the tree. You know, in the country, we didn't have city water. So you had 2 choices, either to dig a well or to dig a cistern to get water. And so he would tell people, dig here, and people would dig there and find water. So these are all from his voice. And There's 3 of them. This one is The Water Witch on Salvation. And this is about me and us one time when we were at the barn. When the horses took off with the wagon and my grandbaby inside, I chased it. My legs nigh on 70 moved like a lightning 20. Down the bank and across the pasture, I hollered, "Up now!" And old Trigger stopped, stood stiff and straight, real proud, cutting his black eyes at me like he was saying, "You owe some gun I showed you." I lifted the baby out, rested her on the ground, safe. That baby took my finger. She didn't cry a lick. We left the wagon, walked the horse back to the barn. Then that girl breaks my grip and runs. She runs through the pasture, up the hill as if nothing happened at all. Not a tear one, ne'er one sign of being scared. The nip in the morning made me think of old hog killing times, made me think of old man Pat, who'd rather see the fresh chitlins rot on the ground than me take 'em home to feed my youngins. I felt old Trigger's breath on my hand, warm and stank. I pat his flank, and we're back to being friends. The hurting in my knee comes back on me like a toothache. Made me wonder if any living thing could ever be tamed. This is The Water Witch on Invasion. So my grandfather was kind of known up on Indian Creek as somebody not to mess with. So it seemed like on Halloween, though, it was sort of a rite of passage for these young white boys in our community that would come and sort of mess with him to see how far they could go. And then he'd always come out with his gun and shoot up in the air. And they were all kind of scared of him. So this is about that. The Water Witch on Invasion. It's serious business to come on a man's land. But when they get a hair up the wrong place, I always have my rifle ready. Sometimes I turn the light on so I can see who their daddies are. Young boys are like that sometimes, smelling themselves, thinking they can do it cause I'm black, cause I'm old, or just cause. Cause I'm a servant of the good Lord is the reason I ain't never shot one yet. I just say, get on now. Get on back where you come from, out into the dark, toward the place where I hear the leaves rustling. Next most all I hear is the gravel crunch as they head on down the road. Sometimes they come closer still. That's when I poke that old 22 up toward the trees and let it rip 3 times. It's serious business to step foot on a man's land, but sometimes when I hear their feet traveling away from me like spooked cattle in the dark, I can't help but to laugh. Then this last one is called The Water Witch on Reading. You know, sometimes I think we, not to be anti-intellectual or anti-education, that's what I do, right? But I think sometimes when we're in these little close circles, we forget that wisdom and education comes in a variety of manners. And my grandfather only had a 3rd grade education, but he was a mathematician. He had to keep the books for his farm. He would always get in trouble with my grandmother by giving me the answers when I was doing math problems. And so I wouldn't know how I got the answer, but I would have the right answer when I went to school. So he was always in trouble that way, or in trouble with my grandmother, Christine, for doing that. So this is called The Water Witch on Reading. Oh, I cipher pretty good, and can't no man cheat me on my crops or on my change at the feed store. I'm known around these parts for being able to remove a wart with a bean. I'm the only one they come to when they want their well witched, and now everybody asks me how many snows we're going to have come winter, or when they need to pull a baby from the mama's tit. Man from way off stopped here once for me to teach him how to make sorghum. Been learning all my life. I can read a map, can read a man's eyes and see if he's truthful. I can level a girder by sight. I can read the tremble in a cow's gut, a man's footprints in the mud. I can read a man's heart to see if he's right with the Lord, though it ain't my place to say. I can read time by my own shadow. I can read the corners of Christine's mouth and tell if she's mad at me. Only thing I can't read is words.
Yes, that makes me think of my own grandfather because, and I wrote an essay about this one time. There's so many things, and I think this is part of what it means to be Appalachian. You know, we measure everything. You go back to that institutional way of doing things. Everything is measured by a different standard, but we know, you know, my grandfather was a woodworker, so he had a fifth grade education or something like that, but he was far better at math and geometry than I'll ever be. You know, he could read the woods, he could read plants, he knew his Bible. I mean, King James version of the Bible is not easy. Telling that story in that voice is so much more meaningful, I think. Letting them
Yeah,
speak
it's
in their
special to
voices.
me to bring them into the room with me to let them come alive for a while. And my grandfather was really a quiet person, a quiet man, really speculative. Unless something was going on, then he could get loud. Yeah, I'm hoping one day to write an entire book in his voice.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to grab a question. Studies have shown that the Appalachian dialect is becoming more mainstream or leveling. We call it leveling when features start to disappear. And it says, what advice would you give to others, maybe writers, to prevent the disappearance of Appalachian Englishes? Or is that what we're doing in our work when we write in that voice?
I think it is.
Preservation important to you?
Yeah, I think preservation is important. And I think that anything that we can do, because, you know, there are a variety of people, if you think about Native peoples, for instance, whose there's entire dialects, entire languages that have disappeared. So I see the Appalachian dialect as its own particular language with all of these. And then that's not a monolith either. Like you can't have there's not just one. You know, one of my favorite pastimes, especially if I'm, you know, before COVID, if I was in the mall or especially around the hospitals, because everybody from the neighboring counties come in. And so if I had something to do, I was always looking for somebody from Kiese County. And so I would sit and be waiting on my appointment, or I'd be in the mall, and it was like, I'd be like a homing pigeon, like I could hear it. And it wasn't just a Kentucky dialect. It wasn't just like an Eastern Kentucky dialect. My kids hated this. My head would spin around and I'd say, where are you from? And they would say Kiese County. And I'd say, I knew that from listening to you. So I think that is special and it needs to be preserved. So of course, if you're a writer, write in those voices. If you are working in anthropology or some other field, make sure you get a recording of it somehow. Interview those folks so that we have a record that we were here. Because I think that, you know, people will say, if you don't have a record and you're not documented, people will say you were never here.
The Appalachian poets. So Frank X. Walker came here many, many, many years ago. That was the first time I'd heard him read from his book, Appalachia. And then he came a couple of years ago with some of his students, I believe, and some of the Appalachian poets, and they brought Black Bone, which has your wonderful poem, O Tobacco, in it. Can you talk about, for people that may not have heard the term Appalachia or know about the Appalachian poets, what that means and how that has contributed to your growth as a writer?
Sure. You know, Frank had been a student. He was a student at UK. I mean, he teaches there now, but he'd been a student at UK. The Appalachian poets, even though all of us were sort of in it, really began with him and a writer named Ricardo Nazario Colon. And they would get on the elevator and, you know, they were macho guys playing basketball. There weren't that many male poets around, certainly not male poets, black men that were poets. So they get on the elevator and they'd pull the stop button and they'd pull out their notebooks, read poetry to each other, start the elevator, and then just kind of, you know, give somebody dap and go on to what they were doing. So that was happening. And then they started going to readings. And so there was a reading that said something like great Appalachian writers or the best contemporary Appalachian writers. And he went probably up on UK's campus or to the library, to the public library, and looked up the word Appalachia. And you can find it if you look in an old dictionary. It said white people, indigenous to the Appalachian region. And so he began to think, where does that leave the rest of us? And so he went home and he wrote the poem Appalachia, taking the P's out and dropping the F's in. And then the group became the Appalachian Poets. So there's something powerful about being named and being able to see yourself. And I think that was empowering for all of us at that time, to think about, if we're excised out of this definition, how can we insert ourselves in? So we were sort of inserted in the conversation the way that the F's were inserted. And it was one of the first places for me that I felt that I could be my entire self. That, you know, I was trying to get my writing career going. I wouldn't have called it a career then. What I was trying to do then was be a better writer. And so I was going to conferences. And so I went to one of the first conferences that was put on by Marita Golden. And so there was a Black Writers Conference in Virginia. And I actually drove an old Cadillac that was like the president's car. I was working at Midway College at the time, and they knew how badly I wanted to do this. And I had a jalopy, so they put me in the car and let me have the president's car, which was a big Lincoln Continental that I was driving across states. And I went and I loved it. And I loved being around other Black writers. But again, there was no one who spoke like me. There was no one there at the time that had that experience of region for me. So I enjoyed myself. And then it would be the same way when I would come back home and I would go to like the beginnings of the Appalachian Writers Conference, and I would go and everybody treated me nicely, but I would look around and I was the only Black one there. And so coming into the circle of the Appalachian poets was the first time that I said, oh, I can be my whole self in this room. That was empowering, and that was to see myself in the room was empowering, and to have an understanding without explanation of what I was writing. You know, we could talk about craft because I didn't have to explain my dialect. I didn't have to explain what my characters were doing, why they were doing what they were doing. And so it was extremely helpful to me and extremely important in sending me off into the world as a writer.
I think that's what the Appalachian Writers Workshop has done for so many of us who hadn't found our place yet, because I'm in the part of Virginia that borders Eastern Kentucky, in the coal fields of Wise County. And so you go north and it doesn't take long before you're out of, you know, any kind of Appalachian territory as far as people are concerned, you know, so you don't find, like you said, you don't find writers conferences that understand where you're coming from. And so, yeah, I think it's important to find your tribe, to find like-minded people, to find your, you know, the group that's going to support and understand and reinforce that. Do you have O Tobacco with you? Can you read it?
I do. It's actually in, this is my new book, Perfect Black.
The one that's coming out in
it's in here because this is the first volume of poetry I've had. Like several of these poems have been published or anthologized in different places, but this is the first volume of my poetry. My grandmother would be mad at me because I write so much about my grandfather, but this is also about my grandfather. It's an ode. It's called Ode Tobacco. Oh, tobacco, you are the warm burnt sienna of my grandfather's skin, soft like ripe leather. I cannot see you any other way but as a farmer's finest crop. You are Kentucky tiller's livelihood. You were school clothes in August, the turkey at Thanksgiving, Christmas with all the trimmings. I close my eyes, see you tall, stately green, lined up in rows, see sweat seeping through Granddaddy's shirt as he fathered you first. You were protected by him, sometimes even more than any other thing that rooted in our earth. Just like family, you were coddled and cuddled and coaxed and making him proud. Spread out for miles, you were the only pretty thing he knew. When I think of you at the edge of winter, I see you brown, wrinkled, just like Granddaddy's skin. A 10-year-old me plays in the shadows of the stripping room. The wood stove burns, calloused hands twist through the length of your leaves. Granddaddy smiles, nods at me when he thinks I'm not looking. You are pretty and braided, lined up in rows, like a room full of brown girls with skirts hooped out for dancing.
I love that image.
Well, you and I were talking about earlier that we know what a stripping room is like. I think they strip different now, but you know, when they had the old tobacco sticks and I just remember that image of the way that the tobacco sat on the stick before it was hung, and with the leaves hanging down, always looks like skirts for me.
It does. I don't know how many of you attendees have worked in tobacco, but if you know what it means to be riding in a car and to have an elder look at a tobacco field and say, boy, that's a pretty tobacco field, you understand what it means for it to be pretty.
Yeah, and that's how he was about his crops, or he'd say, "It sure is. I got some pretty corn this year." If my grandmother said, "Do you like my dress?" he'd say, "Yes, all right."
Not tobacco.
But I don't know if you see that anymore. That sort of pride in the hard work that you've put in.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of like I was thinking as I was rereading that it's kind of like coal. The coal industry's declined quite a bit here, and not so many people are. You'll see some tobacco down in Lee County where I'm from. You still see it being put out, but not as much. And my kids will never know the memory. I mean, they won't know the memories that I have of working in tobacco and grading tobacco and making molasses, and what it's like to sit around and listen to the older folks tell the stories and watch their fingers work and how good they were at what they did and the pride that they took in what they did. And as hard as that was, it's such hard work. I can look back now and be grateful for the experience. And certainly all of that has infused my writing at some point or another, but it makes me sad that my kids won't know about it unless in pictures, but I've preserved it. And that's what we were talking about, preservation and how important it is to preserve that in story and in poem. What do you tell when you do workshops and classes and people are, I asked the same question of Jane Hicks and Georgella Lyon. What do you tell fledgling poets or people who are intimidated by poetry? They love it and they want to write it, but they're intimidated by form and meter and all of that.
Well, I think there's a lot of ways to be a poet. There's lots of ways, and I think often what's neglected is the voice, is the natural voice. There are form poems and there are rhyming poems, and it's often that when someone thinks of a poem, they think they have to have that meter, that rhyming meter, that they have to have those things to write a poem. But when you're writing free verse, you can go anywhere, not anywhere, but you have a lot of room to write and to play with line, to play with stanza, to play with form within free verse. And I think it is a good place. I know a lot of my beginning creative writing students get upset with me at the beginning because they come into creative writing class and they think they're going to write, I don't know what, probably like I was at that age. They think they're going to write like, there's nothing in my own experience or in my own family that I could possibly write. So what am I going to write about? I'm going to write about taxi cabs in New York, even though I haven't been, or we just went on that one field trip. So I try to get them to write closer and closer to the bone, to sort of capture their own experiences, their own family, their own memories. And pretty soon, these things are sort of bubbling out of them when they tap into that. And whether it comes out as a poem or it comes out as a story or it comes out as an essay, there's a sudden outpouring of things when your memory's tapped through writing prompts and through, a lot of times it's like pulling teeth, like, come on. But once you get them going, there's some beautiful things there from every culture, from every region. And I love that. There's something too about being specific about specificity of place. And the closer and closer you get to being specific about the place and the people and the concrete images of the place and the people and the thingitude, as I call it, what things populate a room or populate a yard or populate a neighborhood or populate a county, then the more international it is, right? The more national it is, the more that it can be received from a wider public. So that's one thing that we work on of closing in on the personal, and by writing closely about the personal and being intentional in your words, how that will then cross boundaries and reach other people.
And you wrote a beautiful novel called The Birds of Opulence, and it tracks generations of family through time. I didn't know if you wanted to read some of that or talk about the inspiration for that.
I can talk about the inspiration for it. It's here. I hope it's not holding up my computer. I can't even put my hands on
right here.
I can't put my hands on the copy right now, but The Birds of Opulence, I have been writing a really long time. One thing that I wanted to do, if you talk about close to the bone, like I've been trying to write about my mother's mental illness forever. And I would write about it a little bit in a poem, or I try to write an essay about it. I just couldn't get to it. But once I put it as a thread in the novel and gave, one tiny thread of my own experience to those characters, it really took off from there. And I see The Birds of Opulence almost like a poem. It's interesting that sometimes you write a book and it teaches you something. Birds of Opulence taught me that my essayist self and my fiction self and my poet self was housed in the same body, and that they didn't need to be separated, not always, that I could bring them all together to sort of write this book. And it's a small book, right? It's right around 200 pages, but it took more than a decade, almost 2 decades to write, because I kept thinking, if I'm going to go from short stories to a novel, then I've got something to prove to the readership, whoever the readership is, that I've got to have this big, bulky, linear thing that people are going to understand that this is a novel with a capital N, and they're going to be able to hold it. It's going to have lots of weight to it. And I spent a long time beefing this book up just to have, the sort of the page count. And then I realized that I was talking about mental illness. I was talking about ancestral memory, the ways in which things are passed from generation to generation, and the choices that we make going into the next generation. There are things that are out of our control, things that are in our blood, your blue eyes from your grandma, the way, I was telling somebody else the other day that all my pictures, I have like a little hump on my wrist. And so I've noticed that I've gotten older, that if I'm holding my hands down to the side and someone takes a photograph, it's my grandmother and my great grandmother. Like, it's the same arms. So those are things that are in our blood. Mental illness, is it in the blood? But then there are things that we have a choice in. Family dysfunction, pathology. If you were whipped as a child, are you going to whip your children in the next generation? So those were things that I was playing with. And I think that because those things were themes in the novel, that it lent itself to distillation, to boiling those things down to the essence, not making them bigger, but boiling them down. And so I took my poet eye and revised the novel with my poet eye, and that's what ended up getting published. I mean, I took a lot out. I took as much out as I thought the reader could stand and still have the imprint of what my intention was. So I thought that form met content, that because it was about ancestral memory, because it is about mental illness, that having those short, distilled passages with some lyricism made them more palpable.
So when you're choosing to write about something, how do you make the decision about whether it's going to be a poem or a short story or a novel?
I don't. I mean, I have to eventually. When I was writing The Birds of Opulence, it felt bigger. Like it felt bigger. It felt more, it had more connective tissue than a short story collection, even though my second book was a cycle. So that's what I mean. Like every book that I write teaches me something. So the second book, Water Street, taught me that I could write a composite novel, that I could have characters that know each other. They're all on the same street. That gives some sort of continuity. And then Birds of Opulence taught me that the poet, the essayist, the fiction writer could all live in the same house. And then this book taught me that it's okay to be vulnerable and let the poem stand without, and to be vulnerable in the poems and to write close to the bone without sort of layering it on with fiction. This is probably the most scary book for me because I feel I've written poems that are very, I can't say they're confessional, but they're very close to the bone. They're very much close to my own personal, not all of the speakers of the poems are me, but they live somewhere really close to me, and they're not hidden in a way that I can write something very close to my own experience or close to me in ways that a reader would know, because in my fiction, I'm layering the fiction on top of the literal truth. Mm-hmm. And so often, now being published makes you have to work on a project, right? And so if you have a contract, you have to work on a project. And usually I know when I'm sitting down that, okay, I'm working on the novel or I'm working on the essay. But when I have time to be my most authentic self when I'm sitting down to write, I don't know. I have a list of things, of ideas that I'm working through, and I won't know until the next time I come back to it exactly what it is.
I'm going to grab one last question, and it is from the Q&A. How have you changed as a writer? I guess it's asking from beginning to now, the trajectory of your writing career.
I think that, it's all sort of been in stages. One thing that I appreciate is this sort of natural movement to the next level. Like I think each book teaches me how to write better. So I don't see it necessarily as a hierarchical thing that I'm just going up. Like, I mean, it might be this way that I'm writing on a particular level or a particular plateau, and then there's a pinprick through the clouds, and I'm like, oh, that looks interesting. Let me go over here. And sometimes it's this way, or whatever way it is. And I think I'm a writer who leans into my imagination. And I'm happy to return to that, because I think that that's how I started out. And then I think there was a period of time where once I received my education as a writer, where I felt like I had to be, some writer with a capital W, and I had to show off these things that I had learned. But then it's just like that thing I talked about at the beginning of my tongue returning home. I think my pen did too. Like, return to sort of the natural state of how I naturally write, with those craft elements still sort of circling around, but they weren't in front. I'm a writer who doesn't lead with the head. I lead with gut and heart, and then followed by the head. Like, I use the head and my mind for revision. But when I'm writing, I'm 10 years old. Like, I am in it for the play of it. I'm not in it to publish. I'm not even in it for the next project. I'm in it for the pure pleasure of seeing where it goes. If I'm writing about my people, I'm in it to honor the people in some way. And then at some point I step back and say, okay, what is this? Does it make sense? But I don't think about any of that when I'm writing. And there was a time when I did, and it was sort of overwhelming to think about, and it stagnated my writing. But I don't do that anymore.
So does it feel like I'm thinking about how many times I've said, oh, if I publish a book, I'll have made it. If I do this, I'll have made it. Like, do you feel like you've won these awards, you've got this other book coming out? I mean, do you ever get to a point where you feel like, I've done it, I'm there, or does it just?
No.
I've talked to people about this at Heinemann that are like these, acclaimed writers, and I know one said to me, and I would have never believed it when she said it, but she said, I still am insecure today as a writer as I was when I began, and it was so hard for me to understand that.
Yeah, same thing. Yeah, it's been different over the years. I had said that if I ever got something published in a magazine I'd heard of, I would have made it. And then if I ever get a book published, I will have made it. And then it just it doesn't stop. Like, I think that now that I'm in my 50s, I feel like I'm chasing the clock. Like, I feel like I have so many ideas and so many books that I want to write. I feel a particular pressure. Well, now that my children are raised and I can have sort of a freedom to write more, and I have this long list of ideas, and I do feel sort of a pressure to get the next book and to get the next book, which is a good feeling. But yes, I'm still extremely insecure. Every time I turn something in, it's almost like, you don't like this, do you? Like, that's kind of how I feel. Like, if somebody wants something and wants me to write about something, that's when I hit the send button, it's like, this is not going to work. And I'm always surprised if they like it, even if they have edits. I'm always surprised that.
So it never goes away.
No, never.
I just wish all the best, and I'm just so happy for you and all of the good things that are coming your way. I'm just glad that we got you when we did, because I know that you're about to be very busy. So it's so good to talk to you. So good to talk to you.
Good to talk to you too. We could do this all night.
I know, I could. I really could, but I won't. But thank you, and I can't wait to talk to you again.
I just wanted to take a minute and thank our newest patrons, Allison M. and David C. Thank you so much for subscribing, and we appreciate your support. Look for a bonus episode with Crystal Wilkinson and bonus content coming up in future weeks, and I'll also have a sticker in your mailbox very, very soon.